My name is Brooks Barrett. I am the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I am excited to be with all of you today and to be joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm from Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. We are delighted to have this webinar today with two excellent guests who will be focusing us on the topic. We called this webinar Worker Justice is Climate Justice. And so we'll really be focusing in on the concept of what's called a just transition. And so we'll learn more about that. If you've never heard that phrase, we will learn more about that phrase and what it means in just a minute. But I want to get us started today. We always start with some theological framing. And so I'm going to turn things over to my co-host, Michael Malcolm, and I'm telling everybody that I just feel out of place today because I'm the only one on the show who's not a Michael. I talked with my parents about this, but we've got Michael, and Michael today. And so I'm going to turn things over to Michael Malcolm, and he'll give us a theological framing. So go ahead, Michael.
Well, thank you, Brooks, and thank you, Michael, and thank you, Michael, for being on the call with us. Thank you all for joining us. I thought about what creates worker injustice, and I think the same mentality that creates worker injustice is the same mentality that creates our climate injustice, and it's centered in theological tension. I must admit that I've struggled with this particular theological reflection. I've struggled because I thought, well, shouldn't everybody know that worker justice is a faith principle? But I'm reminded of the time when the Hebrews are told to make bricks without straw. This norming of this extractive mentality is also the same norming of this extractive mentality that permeates society today. The same mentality that created worker injustice is the same mentality that creates the climate crisis that we're facing right now. Today, this climate crisis has created even harsher conditions for outside workers, overproduction, which has created greater demand on inside workers, and a resource shortage that has created stress on the planet. Moses is sent as by the Creator as an ambassador to show liberation to these people experiencing this environmental injustice. We are also called to be ambassadors that bring a message of liberation. As we look at not just the injustices of the land, not just as the injustices of these worker conditions, but even in our planning of finding these solutions, we must also look to make a just transition. And it is up for us as faith leaders, it is up for us as those who lead out in community, who have a sense of faith, to stand up as ambassadors for justice. Today, we are being provided with tools to help us in our call by Mike Williams as well as Michael Leon Guerrero, and we welcome them. This has been my theological reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good as always. Terrific to have that theological framing for our conversation today. The way I think about it is God's justice can't be kept in silos. So, of course, worker justice is going to be climate justice. How are we going to have a wonderful green economy if we're not having an economy where there is justice for workers and where we're not exploiting both the natural world around us and our fellow humans? And so, to me, it all makes sense. So thank you for that framing. I'm now going to introduce our two guests for today. So first, I'm going to introduce Michael Leon Guerrero, who will speak to us in a second. He is the Executive Director for the Labor Network for Sustainability, which works with trade unions, worker centers, and labor support organizations to advance a climate action program that will help the labor movement be a leading force for a just transition to a climate-safe and equitable economy. Before coming to the Labor Network for Sustainability, Michael has had a number of impressive leadership positions. He was the national coordinator for the Climate Justice Alliance, a very renowned organization. He was the executive director for the Southwest Organizing Project, with lots of successes at the state level in organizing for environmental justice. He had leadership roles in the world and U.S. social forums for a number of years. He is a board member for Greenpeace and has been on the board for Jobs with Justice. And so organizations familiar to many of us, we're delighted to have you, Michael. And now for the other Michael, Michael Williams. He is the Deputy Director of Blue Green Alliance, an organization devoted to uniting the largest labor unions in the country with some of the most influential environmental organizations. Their goal is to solve today's environmental challenges in ways that create and maintain quality jobs and build a stronger, fairer economy. Mike has led advocacy initiatives on Capitol Hill and in states across the country. He has an extensive background on issues related from climate change, clean energy, infrastructure, procurement policies, and was also involved in overseeing the launch of the landmark policy initiative Buy Clean, a first of its kind policy that was signed into law in California in 2017. Prior to joining the Blue Green Alliance, Mike worked as a congressional staffer and helped author the Climate Matters Act, among the most progressive pieces of climate legislation at that time. So we have got two heavyweights with us today. We will let Michael Leon Guerrero take it away first and present to us and share with us. Go ahead, Michael.
Great, thank you, Brooks. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, okay, great. And thank you, Reverend Michael, for grounding us in that reflection. Mike, always good to be on with you. And also just want to thank, it's great to reconnect with the United Church of Christ. When I was doing environmental justice organizing for many years in New Mexico, United Church of Christ was actually critical to a lot of the formation of the environmental justice movement and providing support for many decades. So it's great to be back in the loop with you all again. So thanks for the invitation. And Brooks, if you could send me that introduction that you just did, because you did it better than I would have done. So I'd appreciate to have that for my notes. I've got some slides I'm going to try to share with you all, and hopefully I can do this without too many glitches. And so please let me know if you can see this, if this does pop up on your screen correctly. There we go.
Looking good.
Great, thank you. So I'm not going to give another introduction for LNS. As I said, Brooks, I think, did a terrific job of that. What I'm going to talk about in my presentation is about the kind of the roots of the just transition conversation, and what's some of the what's happened in the past and the experience with that, how it's evolved over time to where we are today, and then some of the thoughts and recommendations in terms of what we need to do in regards to that. I was also asked to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal, so I will talk about that briefly in the context of this presentation and how just transition relates to that. So the first thing I will say about just transition is it's I guess you could say it's somewhat a contested term or even controversial term. Even, for instance, the president of the United Mine Workers Association, Cecil Roberts, has said that I've never seen one. We have spoken with a number of unions, workers that have gone through some kind of a transition in their industry, and honestly, I could say that there are probably more bad examples we can point to than good ones of where transitions have actually happened, and not necessarily on the policy side, but a lot of times on implementation, where workers have gone through training programs, there's no jobs on the other end, just not a lot of real foresight and forethought into how to do the programs. And the implementation side in particular is where things fall short. And so we think this is, as proposals like the Green New Deal and other climate policies are being developed, there's more and more attention around the question of just transition and in particular, what happens to the workers in the fossil fuel industry that would need to transition out of those jobs. And we really can't have climate policy without a just transition plan in place to make sure that we address that question of displacement, not just for the workers, but for the communities that they live in. So anyway, just to give folks an idea of the significance and the importance of that, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot more attention to the whole issue. Just transition started being talked about in the 80s and 90s. In particular, there was a union called the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which is now is merged into the United Steelworkers years ago. And it was really kind of popularized by this union because obviously, as you can tell by the name, these are workers that were involved in these industries that were going to be affected. And at that time, they talked about it as a super fund for workers. And many of you may be familiar with the Superfund program, which is the federal cleanup program for some of the most toxic sites around the country. And the president of the union, Tony Mazzocchi, talked about how it was just as important as we're addressing the issues of the land that there also be a helping hand to make a new start in life for those that have really kind of given their lives to this industry and really the livelihoods that we have today in terms of energy and other aspects of our lives that are dependent on fossil fuels. So Tony Mazzocchi was a veteran along with a labor leader, and he envisioned the Just Transition programs as modeled after the GI Bill of Rights, which was a transition program really for soldiers coming back from World War II. And it provided things like 4 years of tuition and a living wage. And the GI Bill of Rights helped to forestall mass unemployment and economic dislocation as folks were coming back from the war. But the term since then has really kind of evolved over the years. And you'll hear it talked about a lot in environmental justice circles and in other sectors as well around this question of just transition as we're dealing with climate policy. A good friend of ours, Todd Bashan, who's at the Labor College at Rutgers University, kind of frames it in three different kind of perspectives around just transition. So he talks about a protective transition, a proactive transition, and a transformative transition. So where I was at, and I think maybe it sounded like the example Mike was giving was very similar. I don't know if this is the same plant you were talking about, but this is in Buffalo, New York. I was talking about a proactive transition, and I think Mike described what that actually looks like, which is basically it's the community and the workers and the unions working together for the transition. So it's not just specifically about the workers that are going to be transitioned, but it's actually also taking into account the impact on the community, the tax base. And in this case, in Tonawanda, New York, there was a coalition of an environmental justice group working with the unions on the transition for that. And they call it the Huntley experiment. And it's really, I think, a great example of how community and labor can work together on transitions like this. There was also one that actually has some precedents that was really kind of interesting. And the Just Transition Alliance was established in the mid-1990s. And this was a partnership between the OCAW, the union I mentioned before, and environmental justice networks. And what they did at the time, it was really kind of innovative stuff where the community members on one side of the fence line partnered with the union local that was represented inside the plant. And they agreed to mutually support each other's issues. So the community would support the bargaining demands of the union would support the environmental justice demands of the community. And they did some interesting collaborative projects, for instance, where they would do a health survey, and the workers would be involved in conducting the health survey in the community. The community would work with the union on getting the members, the union members, interviewed about health and safety issues within the plant. So they both got kind of a common understanding of the impacts of the industry on the health and safety. So there were a number of pilot sites in the 1990s where they worked on this project, and I thought it was a really innovative kind of example of how to work together on just transition. More and more you're going to hear, and I think Reverend Michael kind of talked about also this the idea of extraction and extractive economy. And this is from the Climate Justice Alliance, which I used to work for, and the Our Power campaign, which is what Todd would refer to as a more transformative campaign, looking at the actual systems that are extractive. So it's not even just extracting minerals and oil and gas out of the ground, for instance, but it's also talking about how people's labor is extracted. It's talked about how finance is extracted from the community, and how do we transition all of that system to a regenerative economy that recognizes sacredness of Mother Earth, that recognizes cooperation as a core value, ecological well-being, deep democracy, and regeneration of the economy as well. So you'll see this more and more from the Climate Justice Alliance and other spaces talking about how we actually really do a deep transition out of the economy we're facing. You'll even see now, if you go to the Indigenous Environmental Network, and their website, there's ienearth.org, they just conducted a Just Transition assembly in Lawrence, Kansas last week, looking at from the perspective of Indigenous peoples and what that just transition would look like. So they actually have a really, really interesting document on Indigenous principles of just transition, and you can go see that at their website. So they're thinking about this, obviously, again, in a very deep and holistic way. So anyway, so those are just kind of the different ways that just transition has evolved now, and I think there's more and more overlap that you'll find in these conversations where environmental justice groups are involved and labor is involved in envisioning what that looks like. And why this is important is because whether we're talking about climate policy or not, there's already major transitions that are happening in a number of industries, and we've seen that with printing, telecommunications, energy industry, transportation. There's already major shifts that are happening in these sectors that could result in workers being displaced, and that will impact communities. So one of the things that we talk about is how do we actually get in front of these transitions rather than being reactive, particularly in the United States, where we don't have the safety net that other countries have, the social safety net to really address the issues of workers that are displaced from their industries. One of the resources that we developed at LNS is on our website. This was a study that was done for Maryland. We call it Beyond a Band-Aid. And what we encourage governments to do is establish community and worker protection funds in advance and do advanced investment in job creation. So we're not waiting for plants to shut down. We're actually developing the infrastructure and setting aside the resources for transitions as they happen. So we don't have to, so nobody falls through the cracks as these shutdowns and transitions happen. And these are just an idea of some of the provisions that should be included in transitions for workers. And basically it's the rights of workers to be able to organize and bargain collectively. These should be fundamental parts of just transition policies so that we can assure that the transition out of some of these particularly high wage jobs in the fossil fuel industry don't result in low wage work with no protections for the workers. And why is that important? Because here's one example. This is a graph that shows a comparison of the income inequality in the country and how that's gone up in the last several years. That's the red line, and how union density has declined at that time. And you can see that gap and how income inequality has increased as union membership has gone down in this country. And what's also interesting is that you'll see that in the wake of the New Deal era in the 1930s is when that income inequality was at its lowest. So the significance and the importance of unions and organized workers and organized labor is really important in any climate policy moving forward. So again, we were asked to talk about the Green New Deal and how this relates. In the resolution that was introduced in Congress by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Merkley, these are some of the provisions that they included and addressed related to just transition. So they called for a fair and a just transition for all communities and workers, wage protection, guaranteed wages, and benefit parity. So if a worker does get a job at a lower rate coming out of fossil fuel industry, that they would basically get wage protection, and they would be paid at the same rate for a certain period of time until they could transition into another quality job. Decoupling healthcare from employment, providing all people with healthcare and affordable housing, and education and training is included as well. Oh, and I doubled that slide. So anyway, so that's just to, again, just to give you an overview of just transition and kind of where the thinking is around that now. I know Mike already started to give some examples of what that looks like and some of the policies. One of the examples maybe Mike can talk more about is Colorado. The state of Colorado just established a just transition office, first of its kind in the country, which we think is a really good precedent. And it's a good example of what we're talking about in terms of getting ahead of the question around just transition rather than waiting and being reactive, so folks don't fall through the cracks as we go through this transition. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. We'll transition back to the other Michael.
And Brooks, thank you for the introduction earlier. It was quite nice. It's nice when people say nice things about you. It feels like I don't deserve nearly any of them. But if I could then just jump in to, and I guess I'll try to play off where Michael had left off when his computer froze up. We've worked on the issue of just transition for quite a long time. So the Blue Green Alliance has been in existence since effectively 2006. So those who don't know, we're partnership of labor unions, environmental organizations, as Brooks mentioned. We were founded by the United Steelworkers and the Sierra Club. So Tony Mazzocchi, the person that Michael was speaking of, that ethic, the Tony Mazzocchi folks within the United Steelworkers who came out of the oil, chemical, atomic workers, a lot of that ethic certainly flowed into to our founding. Our founding founders were Leo Gerard, just recently retired president of the Steelworkers, Carl Pope from the Sierra Club, and Dave Foster, who came out of the Steelworkers in Minnesota and done a significant amount of work with steel mill closures, with paper industry disruption. So this issue of transition has been around for so long. And as Michael mentioned, it's something in this country we've never gotten right on any sort of scale. I want to start though with how this effort has been looked at on a global scale. So the beginning of the climate negotiations effort at the United Nations back in 1989, 1990, when that began, the folks at the International Trade Union Confederation were somewhat distanced from that effort for whatever reason it was. But over the next few years and by the mid-90s, the folks at the International Labor Movement started to get much more engaged in negotiations around an international climate treaty. And the piece they got engaged on was explicitly trying to get something around this notion of a just transition incorporated into a global agreement. And it was a long, arduous effort. It was not included in in any of the versions, Kyoto, in any real manner. And then right into the lead up to Paris in 2015, we worked quite closely starting in 2009 in Copenhagen to try to incorporate this notion of a just transition for workers and communities into this process, because as Michael mentioned, where we move climate policy, if we're not injecting economic justice into this process, we're not going to be successful. And so as we move forward with the discussion on how to create the Paris agreements, we finally got it to a place where we incorporated the phrase just transition and just transition for workers and communities. I can look up exactly what it was, but it's in the preamble of the Paris agreements. And what that means is now that at the International Labor Organization, there's going to be an effort to develop just transition plans alongside of countries across the world. It's a good effort, but it's not what we were specifically aiming for. Ideally, we were trying to put that into a place where it would have to be implemented, so that when every country submitted its plan, they would have to submit a plan for how they're going to take care of working people and their communities when they put forward plans to eradicate greenhouse gas emissions from their economy. We're still fighting to get that point. Now, I wanted to start there because I wanted to just give some grounding to how this debate has been around in terms of policy and program and implementation, because it has been something that the labor movement across the world has worked on and focused on for a couple 3 decades. And I was going to bounce off of Michael giving basis on the term just transition and the backing of that, but I'll just flow into it, the other examples that I wanted to talk about, because Michael was correct that there's a lot of examples of transition in this country, but there are very, very few examples of anything that would anywhere resemble something that we could call just. I do want to touch on a few where it worked. I don't want to harp on the discord and the difficult transitions. We can talk about those for days. The manufacturing regions and facilities that dealt with global trade, so on and so forth. There's just so many bad examples, but a few places where we've seen it work. In the state of Washington, in an area called Centralia, it was the last coal plant in the state of Washington. And there was a long effort to try to shut that coal plant down. It was a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions as well as toxic air pollution emissions in the state. And the folks at the Sierra Club and a number of other organizations in the state of Washington had been working for years to figure out a date of closure for it. The workers at that plant obviously did not want that to happen. They're represented by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. But in 2011, they came to an agreement on setting a date for closing the plant. And it was a 15-year phase out, kind of a long phase out, but there's 2 major boilers. One of them was a shorter phase out. It's going to be closing in 2020. The other boiler by 2025. They're going to have to incorporate toxic air emissions reductions. And most importantly, the 2 pieces here is that all the workers within that plant are going to be provided a chance to shift over to other jobs within the utility structure. So they will most likely they definitely won't see any impact on their benefits and their healthcare, their retirement. They also probably won't see much difference in terms of wage scale. So the direct impact on the workers within that facility is almost nil. The other big piece of this is that there was an agreement from the utility to inject $55 million into that community to try to replace what that community had for a tax base. And that captures the 2-pronged pieces, the 2 pieces that must go into anything that is a just transition: taking care of the workers who actually work at that facility, and then taking care of the community. So it's effectively an economic development plan and just a direct support for workers. And Michael was going to get into that with his piece on, I liked how, I hadn't heard how Todd described proactive, protective, and I've lost the third one. But that's an example of how you could start to get to that. So that's one example. Yeah, and Michael, I don't know if it's just that we are so simpatico on these issues, or that there really just aren't that many other examples, because we are definitely have overlap. So I was going to talk a bit about Tonawanda and the Huntley Alliance. So it's great that you brought that up. It's really to your exact point, it's a great example of the community coming together, setting aside potential differences and previous fights and such, and trying to just look forward and figure out how to do that. Michael mentioned it. It's just so folks have some of the background. The organization Clean Air Coalition in New York, the unions involved, the electrical workers were the representative union of the workers at the plant, but then also a number of the unions that are in the area. The steelworkers represent a number of facilities throughout that region. The teachers and others all joined together, and they created what was called the Huntley Alliance. The Sierra Club was involved for a bit. Sierra Club caused some problems, and I say that Sierra Club's our founding member, but they held some protests early on and blew up the whole alliance. And then it all came back together. People set aside differences, but all came together to think through what redevelopment and what the future would be for the Tonawanda area. And they put together a report called Tonawanda Tomorrow that called for direct investment in community. They took it to their state legislators. They got it passed, created a $30 million fund, a big chunk of it going to Tonawanda. Governor Cuomo, a year or so later, he put forward a plan to phase out most, if not all, probably all of the coal in the state. And the legislature decided to expand that fund to start to help other communities transition. So it's just really a good example of when folks come together and start working together, we can have a cascading effect in a good way. It's a really positive example. That said, when we talk about what the transitions actually look like, that fund has been used to effectively not fire teachers in the area. So we're not looking at some sort of big rebirth and regrowth in the area. Right now, they're just holding pat. So we should be realistic and clear-eyed that this is incredibly hard. And it's really expensive to actually redevelop these areas. So, and that's really, I mean, look, that's one of the most important things. That they're keeping teachers there, they're keeping schools open, they're keeping other major services involved, up and running there. That is extraordinarily important. You can't do anything if you don't have that. So it's really great. But we shouldn't say like, oh, they did it. They got, a couple $1 million fixed. Not the case. They're holding pat, and they've set a great example. So it's a really good thing. Similar situation in Centralia, where there's, that I mentioned earlier, where they've had perhaps a little more success, but that's probably potentially only because of the amount of time, though they did have a bit more money invested. $55 million from the utility, matched by another 10 to 15 million from the state of Washington. They've actually attracted a couple companies. Solar company is going to be sourced where the power plant was. They've done redevelopment of a couple projects. So there's some potential economic development examples there. So, but again, this is hard. This is really hard. And we can give an example of one of the worst cases of transition. If you're familiar with the county, McDowell County in West Virginia, it's an old coal mining county. There are no more coal mines anymore. They've all shut down. But it was an absolute economic disaster. There was no effort at transition, and it fell apart. And so that is effectively ground down to zero. And so if we compare it in that sense, that's a likely, I mean, everything points towards that direction if we don't get out ahead of it. But folks like people in Centralia and in Tonawanda are pulling away from that and trying to create what that future could be. So a few other pieces I do want to mention. One of the ways that Tonawanda was also able to get some support was through an initiative back when we had a federal government that wasn't run by crazy people. Pardon me for being partisan, but honestly, in the Obama administration, an effort was created that we worked to help put together called the Power Initiative. And so in 2013, we requested the Obama administration to actually take this issue of transition seriously. And knowing that Congress was useless and couldn't get anything done, we requested them to do everything they could in their power. And what that means was to direct high-level staff to coordinate on this issue, and then to take as much funds across the federal government you could to direct it at these transitioning areas to start to help us change this problem. And thus out of that grew what was called the Power Initiative. And so it collected these funds and was able to provide grants to communities to help them with planning and set up the initial stages so these communities could join together like they did in Tonawanda. In fact, Tonawanda was one of the early recipients of these grants and helped them with multi-stage planning. Sadly, 2016 happened and Donald Trump happened, so that does not exist anymore, the Power Initiative. Some of its good work is still there. Some of the funds had been spent out even into his administration, but it's an example of how the federal government started to take this on for the first time in history, in our history, I guess, in any real manner. The other example Michael started to mention was the state of Colorado. So we have a Colorado Blue-Green Alliance, And we've been working with the Colorado AFL-CIO, the electrical workers, the plumbers and pipe fitters, and a number of other folks in Colorado who represent folks throughout the energy industry there. And interestingly enough, those folks in those unions in the 2018 election, they represent fossil fuel generation, extraction, moving all around. They also happen to be the first organizations to endorse the most environmental candidate in the Democratic primary in Jared Polis. Jared Polis soon became Governor Polis, and so one of his main charges was he wants to make Colorado into a leader on climate change. And so the folks at the IBEW and the UA said, okay, we'll work with you, but we want to be able to deal with this issue and take care of our workers and where they live and their communities. And so what happened was a great collaborative effort around policy. And this is the first time we've actually had a chance to really do this on policy issues, where the development of a climate plan that drastically reduced emissions in one bill, I forget the name of it, the Colorado Climate Action Bill, that set a series of decreasing emissions targets, eventually down to almost zero for the state of Colorado, as well as a ramp up of their renewable energy generation. But then in addition, the creation of an Office of Just Transition with the directive to do a number of pieces, which we helped draft this effort. And so it was agreed upon from the unions, from the environmental organizations, from folks in environmental justice, to all say, we're going to support each other through this process. Folks testified across bills. So the head of the Colorado AFL-CIO testifying to support this really impressive, expansive effort to take on climate change. Folks from Conservation Colorado and Colorado People's Alliance testifying on behalf of the Just Transition Act. It was just a really good, beautiful effort at coalition building, and it succeeded. I don't want to gloss over the fact that there was definitely difficulties in this process. There were definitely folks who were just like, I don't know if we can get this Just Transition bill, but we supported it. That's all that matters. But that was not, thankfully, the case across all folks. Most of the folks there said, no, let's all hang tight and get everything across the board. The governor, in his, politician ways, while he supported it, he had technocratic concerns and almost vetoed it. So we had to have major efforts to lobby him to not do that. But in the end, he signed it. And so just so folks know what the construct is of it, it sets up an Office of Just Transition. And that's sort of the overarching theme. But it also tasks that office and also effectively a committee. And the committee is chaired by the executive director of the Colorado AFL-CIO. So it's a labor-run committee, effectively, which is a wonderful thing. And also has representation from people in communities. But it's supposed to, this advisory committee is tasked with developing a draft plan that'll push the director of the Just Transition Office to then develop it, start to deploy it, and submit it to the governor and the General Assembly to act on it, and specifically to figure out how to have the state provide benefits to workers to enable to support themselves and their families, to get training and new work, so on and so forth, grants that can be awarded to eligible entities to seek and create a more diversified, equitable, and vibrant economic community, and then other sources of funding. So it's trying to get at that holistic effort to deal with this issue of transition. So it's a good example, and it's one we're looking to take elsewhere, as a number of other states are moving forward on significant climate action. And then, obviously the federal government, if and when the federal government is not mired in impeachment and quid pro quo and racism and misogyny and such, but I'll stop. We put together an effort called the Solidarity for Climate Action Plan that is a platform that we're hoping that nationally, when we get to a place where we can really start to move policy, we can look at this issue of climate change policy and climate change solutions holistically. And the ideas put out here that I've been talking about, that Michael mentioned, would absolutely need to be part of this solution in order for it to be a whole and just solution. So I'll stop there. I've seen that people have questions, and if folks want to certainly take issue with anything I said, I'd love to hear from folks and answer any questions anybody has.
Great, thank you, Michael. And my first environmental campaign as a pastor my first environmental campaign ever was the transition in Centralia. And so in my church, we founded a Beyond Coal chapter. And so that was the engine for that campaign in the Sierra Club. And so I definitely remember some of the tensions, the leading up to it, but good results. So great. Thank you for that candid presentation. So let's take a look at some of these questions. As I take a look at it, just a quick follow-up with you, Michael Williams. That platform you were talking, is that something that we can send out a link to when we email people afterwards?
Absolutely. If you just go to, there used to be an easy, I think there's an easy thing. I probably should know it, but Solidarity for Climate Action.
Okay.
And you will find it on our website.
Awesome. Great. So one of the first questions on here is another Michael, and he is from the UK, based from the United Reformed Church. My question is, just transition to what? Is it to the same economic model premised on growth and progress, largely debt-based, which tend to favor the privileged 1%? Responses to that?
Yeah. Mike, you want to start or you want me to?
I have a feeling we're going to agree. So do you want to start? you have more experience in this realm, but yeah, go ahead.
I think I referenced it later in the PowerPoint, but definitely I think we're looking at how do we address income inequality and issues like race and gender inequality with the same set of policies. And I think that's something that the Green New Deal resolution attempts to do. I think we're starting to see it in some of the presidential candidates' platforms. I think we're seeing it in some of the state policies that are being developed. I think the Solidarity for Climate Action, I think, addresses that in terms of the rights of workers. And so I think there's more and more of a recognition that we have to address these issues, and also really the limits of the planet. We can't keep operating on a growth model and assume that we're going to be able to live the same kind of lifestyles. There are definitely limits to our growth, and there are responsibilities that we have to take care of the planet and our communities. So we're definitely on board with you there.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, the core vision of our platform is we can't solve climate change, the crisis of climate change, if we don't also solve the crisis of economic inequality. And it's likewise, we can't solve the crisis of economic inequality if we ignore the crisis of climate change. So I totally agree with the questioner's point, and yeah.
All right, great.
We have Brooks. We actually had one other question that came before Michael, and I made a mistake and answered it. Let me go back to it. Catherine Gammon asked, does the Blue-Green Alliance still support fossil fuel-based development, especially petrochemical and plastic production based on fracking?
So I don't know that we ever have. So, we're a partnership of 14 organizations, and a number of our unions represent workers in those industries. So we're not going to come out and openly oppose them. We never have, and probably won't. Nor will we. We also represent or have the Sierra Club and a number of other environmental organizations in our partnership. So we're never going to come out and support those industries. And so on the supply side of this equation, it's a complicated thing for us personally. So the answer is we neither support nor oppose specific industries and specific technologies. What we do focus in on is emissions reductions and pollution reduction. And I totally get the point of we need to understand and take serious heed and consideration of the production of energy and where it comes from. I totally understand that. But given the nature of our organization, we're just not in a place to take a position on either of those. So I would take issue with the notion of still. That's not ever been the case, and it won't ever be the case.
Great, thank you. Right. We've got another question here about right to work, and are you basically this person lives in Virginia, with a right-to-work state, where workers cannot be required to support a union. Are you saying that needs to be repealed is the question?
Yep.
All right. We'll answer on that one, I think.
Yep.
All right.
Philip Shea says, a process is unfolding here in Arizona regarding the shutting down of a huge power plant on the Navajo Nation. Current Sierra Club magazine has an article about one of the individuals working to help transition, which is Nicole Horsepower with the Nizoni Ani. What is a way for churches to best offer to be engaged in transitions like this, if you're familiar with what's going on in Arizona?
Mike, did you have a response to that? And
No, please. Your neck of the woods.
Yeah, it is. It's a really, this is a really tough one because of, I mean, up in northwestern New Mexico, the Four Corners area, basically. I mean, they're big power plants up there, and coal mines. Communities are very dependent economically on those, and the transition out of those industries is going to be a very difficult thing. So we know, and it's become a very controversial topic, as New Mexico, for instance, has been also strengthening its climate policies moving forward. So I think there is a role. I'm actually going to be talking to some folks in the next couple of weeks on the Navajo Nation regarding this, and but I do think faith-based communities do have, there's a way that they can support, and as we find out more, be glad to share that information. But I think that's just one example of what we're going to see, particularly in rural areas that are very dependent on facilities like this. That it's going to be harder. And I think maybe it's a bit of a tangent, but it also speaks to the importance, I think, of the federal government being involved, because not all states have the kind of resources. In fact, probably very few, if any, states really have the resources to fund the kind of transitions that we need. And so if it's not coming from the federal level, it's really going to put a lot of pressure, particularly on rural communities and indigenous communities in particular.
Great. Thank you for that response. Let's tackle the next question here. How can we implement these models of regenerative economies in our community when government participation is not in full support? What can happen in our capacity as grassroots movements?
That's a good question. I'll start, Mike. Michael, please correct me what I get wrong. But I think the examples of Tonawanda and Centralia are good ones. I think understanding that government fails us a lot, but we are a people and we can come together as communities. And I think especially places of faith, churches and such, are great centers of communities and can help lead that coming together and that collaborative effort. And so as a community, folks can come together and either solve the problem yourselves and or demand what you need from the government. Both probably would need to happen, but I think that would be my response.
Yep, I agree. I think it all comes down to organizing and how we're building power in our communities. There's a conversation we have with our environmental friends a lot of times about, we get asked, for instance, can we get this union to sign off on this position, and getting off fossil fuels or whatever it is. And we talk about how there's a difference between what we call a positional alignment and a values-based alignment, right? Which is just like not getting just a sign off, but how do we create the spaces to really get deeper into conversations about what are the values that we share and what we need. And I think that helps us develop deeper coalitions and a much broader agenda for the community. So I think that, to me, is the space where we can bring in other sectors, right? How labor can participate, faith communities, environmental justice groups. So I think figuring out how to build that space is the starting point, and identifying those common values and how to move forward together.
Great, thank you. We have time for a couple of more questions, actually. Christina Cross of Illinois Interfaith Power and Light, whoop, whoop. She asked, I work for Illinois Interfaith Power and Light and do outreach in Southern Illinois. I live in a community where 2 coal mines and several regional coal plants are in the process of being closed. I'm part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition that's working toward passage of the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Our governor says he wants the assembly to act on the bill in January, so policy may be moving forward soon. She says, my question is this. My husband is a pastor and we live in a very conservative area. I've been having tough conversations with members of my faith community and outside community. The biggest fear is that the CEJA emphasizes equity and justice. These jobs don't pay with coal mining, where coal mining does. These jobs don't pay with coal mining with only a high school diploma, and that there aren't enough jobs to absorb displaced workers. Any tips on how to engage with these worried workers?
Yeah. Do you want to start, Michael? Do you want me to go?
Oh, you go ahead, Mike.
They're right to be worried. Coal mining, power plant work, manufacturing work, industrial work, especially when it's unionized. Actually, not especially, when it's unionized, pays well, provides healthcare, provides retirement security, and the other jobs that are offered, especially in rural communities, in deindustrializing areas, often, sometimes almost always, are nowhere near as good. You know, I don't want to pick on solar installation because it's incredibly important and we need more of these jobs, but we're looking at $15 to $20 an hour. You know, maybe better than McDonald's and Walmart, but not comparable to the $30 to $45 an hour with union protection, healthcare, retirement security that you get. So they have a right to be worried. And that's where going in and talking to them and saying, these are going to close. What do we need to do to make it so that you are taken care of? So the state of Illinois is bigger than the state of Colorado. Now, I don't know, budget situation may be different, but the state of Illinois should put forward and create an Office of Just Transition and have a just transition plan. The state of Illinois should provide direct support for this community, for these communities. The state of Illinois should provide direct support for these workers. In addition, the federal government should too. Absolutely, the federal government should be the backstop for all of this. We're just not at a political place yet. But until those things happen, I think it is absolutely important to walk into those discussions, and you're not going to convince those workers not to be worried because they should be worried. Their livelihoods are at stake, and there isn't necessarily a good option for them. So then it's walking in and saying, yeah, you're worried and so am I. How do we work together to make this better for you? Because that's what we need to do.
I think that's absolutely right. I think everything that Mike said, and I think, you know, this is why also I think the workers need to be engaged in the process, right? Because, and the state of Illinois does have to take that into account in terms of a just transition and setting up that infrastructure that Mike just talked about. It's going to be crucial. And you know, this point kind of goes to the earlier question, actually, that was addressed to Mike about the position of BGA. I mean, honestly, what we're often asking these workers to do is take a leap of faith, right? I mean, one thing that the oil industry can offer that we haven't been able to is we can give you a job tomorrow working on a pipeline or and a good paying job. And until we can demonstrate to people that it's more than just a leap of faith, that there's actually a safety net, that there's support, it's going to be tough to get convince workers that, yeah, we need to shut down your industry and take your job. So that's why just transition really does have to be core to any of these policies.
Great. Well, we are unfortunately are coming near the end of our time. We always like to end with a call to action. Michael, let's do a little round robin. Michael, do you have any, Malcolm, that is, do you have any comments that you'd like to get us started off with as we reflect on call to action here?
Yeah, Brooks, thank you. I simply want to tell everyone thank you for joining us. But also, again, as always, my call to action is get involved. We are called to be involved as faith leaders in society's everyday life. And we're called to speak truth in power in that being involved. So get involved. That would be my call to action today.
Awesome, thank you. And the other Michaels, any closing thoughts on actions to be taken?
Well, I'll just say, I hope we offered some information that can be helpful for you as you have your, as you do your organizing work going forward. I guess I would just say, continue to visit our sites, our websites, and feel free to reach out to us. And if we can be a resource to you all on any of these issues, we'd be, speaking for us as LNS, we'd be happy to, and I'm sure it's the same for Mike.
We would too. Completely agree with that. And then the only other thing I would add is that, again, the faith community is such a central part of communities across the country, and can be that glue and that spiritual foundation for folks to get through something that's really difficult. And so I would encourage folks to get involved, to step in and say, this is a place for us, and we can help solve this problem.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, Michaels. It's been terrific to have you on. I'm going to personally listen to this whole webinar again just to make sure I fully absorb it, because there's so much good information in here that I think is really critical that I take into my work and that I share with other people. So I'm really grateful and thankful for all that you've done. For those of you who have joined us, thank you so much for joining. And we'll send out an email if Michael Leon Guerrero, I don't know if you have, if you want to share your PowerPoint. We had a question about whether or not you're willing to share your PowerPoint. I'm happy to be a conduit if you want to share websites and reports and anything else that you want to share with those who registered today. We will get that out in the email along with a link to YouTube of this webinar. And next month, we'll be coming back with yet another webinar. We are going to have Anya Schoolman from Solar Neighbors United. And it's going to be Solar Power 101 for churches, but in a different way. It's going to be looking not just at the practicalities of how churches can go solar, but how churches can work with their communities and residents to go solar. So thanks again, everyone, and thank you to our Michaels, and terrific. I hope that we have reason to connect and to work together in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.